Assalamu alaikum everyone, and I hope that you all are well. And I'm very much miss the class activities that we have had in the past. So, so I'm here with a new lecture that is number 14. Your subject is Introduction to Language Studies, and your semester is first, as you all know that. I'm here with a very important lecture. You may come in your exams as well. See how it goes actually. Linguistic approach to language studies. Mainly our topic for today's presentation is approaches to contemporary approaches to linguistic studies. So this topic is that I've written in this slide is linguistic approach to language studies. It's quite similar to that. So there is no difference between them. So what is linguistics? That first question that comes to my mind is what is linguistics? Linguistics, as you all know, that is all about the study of language. However, in as much as linguistic pose different questions about language, they also engage different processes of inquiry about their subject of study. Linguistic analyses are always shaped by the kind of data used and the assumptions underlying their interpretation, regardless of their whether or not this is made explicit by the researcher. So why we study linguistics? Study human languages from a scientific perspective and understand structure and process underlying student errors. Increase learners' interest in language, help learners develop a new approach to understand native and foreign language. So, assumption underlying their interpretation, regardless of whether or not this is made explicit by the researcher. This kind of linguistics relativity is different from the well-known and much discussed Rutherfordian relativity principle, which says that all observers are not led by the same physical evidence to the same picture of the universe unless they are linguistic. This is a little bit of introduction of the linguistics. The topic will get better and easier and interesting as we further go on to the next slides. So fundamental linguistic concepts. Every language is amazingly complex. All languages are highly systematic. Systematically is not transparent to native speakers. Speech is primary, writing secondary. Children are not explicitly taught language, but they acquire it fluently by the age of 5. So since Kubertsky in 1939, we discriminate between phonetics and phonology. Basically, there are there are different types that are very core domains of the linguistic. Methodological reflection on the phonological continuum, illustrated on the ferocity of Swiss German dialect, Beard Siebenhaar and Adrian Lehmann. वो कहते हैं कि we discriminate between phonetics and phonology, where phonology categorically interprets language specific continuous acoustic signals and thereby conceptually separates between a component and meaning and the stream of speech, which both are correlated in second step. Today, the allegedly obvious separation of being questioned one of a number of levels. This softening and what used to be formerly rigid boundaries between phonetics and phonology is particularly prevalent in description of ferocity. So in the context of annotation research, This uneasy connection between phonetics and phonology is hinted at in Bollinger. So let's move on to the next one. There are three aspects of language learning. Learning language, teaching any subject involves teaching the language. Learning through language L is the medium of instruction. Learning about language, academic, explicit, grammar, vocabulary, spelling, phonics, etc., social, political, implicit value, all three aspects affect language acquisition. So further, there are three case studies in Italo-Romance dialects. Phonological typology has mainly concentrated on phonemes, inventories, and on implicational universe, whereas the notion of language type appears to be less appealing form of phonological perspective. And interesting candidates for establishing language types on the grounds of phonological or phonetic criteria would have come from the dichotomy and stress timing versus syllable timing. If instrumental research carried out by a number of phoneticians had not invalidated the fundamental claim of the so-called isochrony hypothesis, nevertheless, the idea classifying languages accordingly. So there are indirect measurements in morphological typology, as I'll discuss it on the next slide as well. And there are descriptive and theoretical linguistics. Theoretical study of linguistics, universals, what is human language and how do we manage to acquire it? And descriptive scientific study of a particular language or comparison language. Phonetics, phonology, units of sounds and how they are organized. Morphology, units of meaning and how they are organized. Basically, phonetics, as you know, that units of sounds and how they are organized. Units, whereas morphology is concerned, units of meaning and how they are organized. And whereas semantics, as you know, that units of speech and how they are organized. So language differ in how much information is packed in a word. Consider example where English uses 4 words for what is expressed in 1 word in Finnish. Finnish is a more synthetic language than English. In maximally analytic word structure and word expresses only one lexical or one grammatical meaning at a time. Accordingly, analytic language have many function words expressing grammatical meaning only, such as prepositions and pronouns. Is systematic word structure as a word expresses several grammatical meanings. So such as preposition and pronoun in syntactic word structure as expresses several grammatical meanings only with its lexical meaning. Grammatical morphemes such as case as a possessive affixes abound, as in 1b where there is a syntactic dialectology possible contribution from Swiss German. There are 3 in the respective and theological linguistics. Linguistic conundrum. Complexity of language, ease of execution on language 1, relative difficulty on acquisition of language 2, and difficulty of understanding but we already instinctively know about language from a scientific linguistic perspective, computer analogy, and layered language acquisition device. So there is no doubt that semantics has been the most neglected linguistic system in classical dactylology. Although there have been several serious attempts by dactylologists to establish dialect syntax as a relevant, and there are no doubt that syntax as a relevant and interesting recent area is in 1909, Spencer in 1599, Holzer and 1969, Patoka and 1989, Tortzinger in 1989, Sees Kleiser in a finding paper from 1994. Ever Walden not only acknowledges the importance of dialect syntax for both dialectology and theoretical linguistics, but he also outlined a research program for the exploration of Swiss German syntax, which turned out to be a remarkably fruitful one. And this chapter deals with the concept of modality. We will show that modality is interesting from both its formal and the semantic point of view, how both forms of meaning can be studied in isolation, and we will also suggest that the best way is to study meaning and form together. So the term modality is used in more than one way. In 1982, Wendell Avorio and Pollingen, but many linguists will agree that the meaning is but many linguistic these are meaning contributed by word, must, and may in language 1 and 2 in models. Same message, different forms. Hey Joe, what's up? Hello Joe, good to see you. And same forms, different message. Is Rosa there? Yes or no? And lexical ambiguity. Why is the baby aunt confused? All his uncles are aunts. Kids make nutritious snacks. Prostitutes appeal to pop. There's a different complexity of language. There are different and same different meanings, and in the same form, lexical ambiguity as well. So you will examine it by your own. Further, this slide continues to chill ambiguity. I saw her duck. I saw her. Shares in having a big stereo sail and big stereo sail. Meaningless message. Contradiction. I am my own grandma. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. And normally, Harry's cat called me on the phone. There are different perspective and descriptive approaches of language. Repetitive rules, correct, reflexive, himself, themselves, and descriptive rules describe, say, irregular, and himself, themselves, and incorrect, reflexive, teach, practice, drill, ideal language, use, traditional language, pedagogy, and observe, real language, use, linguistic approach, new language, pedagogy, you decide. So, it has been known at least since the times of William von Humboldt, language has two sides, the product and the process. So, pragmatic is a study of how to do things with words, and it is applied here in the domain where the process is particularly opaque, in contrast to the open accessibility of the product. There are hundreds of festivals in a van and university library, but hardly any studies of how statistics are made. According to Gokman, an environment is a place where it is easy or difficult to play the ritual game of having R. Further is language description and linguistic topology. So further, the topic that is related to this approaches to the linguistic studies is functional linguistics. Let's see how it goes. introduction, meaning is the primary driver of form in language. Functional linguistics is focused on driving grammatical, syntactical, and textual structures from the ways in which language is used. Systematic functional linguistics is an approach to linguistics that considers language as a system. The label systematic is related to the system network used in the description of the lexicogrammar and human linguistic languages. This is a little bit of introduction of the functional language, functional linguistics, sorry. Communicative function of language. Halliday states that language is the study of how people exchange meanings through the use of language. For example, that the boy ate the bread in the kitchen. Statement: the boy is eating the bread. Commands: eat the bread. Question: is the boy eating the bread? Is a communication function of language, how you can convey your message differently. Theoretical claims. Four main theoretical claims about language are there. The language used is functional. Its function is to make meaning. These meanings are influenced by the social and cultural context in which they are exchanged. The process of using language is a semiotic process and process of making meaning by choosing. There are different things that are related to this theory, and the past decade has been not only a renewed interest in the field of linguistics and the description of lesser known and endangered language, but also the appearances of this more comprehensive undertaking of language documentation as a research field with its own fight. Parallel to this, the study of linguistic diversity has noticeably evolved, turning into a complex and sophisticated field. The development of these two intellectual endeavors is mainly due to the increasing awareness, right? And next is development of linguistic theory in 20th century. Many linguists hold the fact that language is used for communication is largely relevant to its analysis. How did such a view arise? Three main theorists were there. Saussure drew a fundamental contrast between language and speaking. Perrault, Bloomfield proposed a similar distinction: grammar, the linguistic system, versus meaning, the use of the system or particular occasion. Chomsky proposed in a distinction analogous but not identical to Saussure and Bloomfield's, namely competence versus performance. So there is a relation of their distinction with communicative function language. Language, grammar, competence, Perrault, meaning, performance. How can the various communicative functions of language is incorporated into the study of language structure? The two fundamental relations training a structural system are cooperation and systematic and substitution paradigmas. Commandmatic Saussure. Systematic relation define the frame in which paradigmatic relation for names, for morphemes, words, syntax, discourse, speech, events. So in this contribution, I will discuss different methods that can be used to empirically investigable and the dynamic that are at work in multilingual language usage. More specifically, using example from the research and comprehension is foreign or unknown language. I will consider the possibility of combining different methodological approaches. Methodological discussion tend to be rather uninteresting than they are tantamount to the stereotypical attacks at straw men on the far and near side of the qualitative and quantitative divide. The next development of linguistic theory in the 20th century. The idea of extending linguistic analysis to include communicative function was first proposed by Czech linguist Matthew's, part of Prague School, and he and his successors developed the theory of functional sentence perspective. This theory was first brought to the attention of language speaking linguistics in Halliday in 1967, Fono in 1972, and 1972p, and Chaffee in 1972, and applied them to issues that were of concern of theoretical linguistics in the US at that time. By the end of the 1970s, a number of functional approaches were emerging in both the US and the Western Europe. There are dialect context paradigms research in mostly various socio-linguistic examines that linguistic outcomes of the clash to the distinct variation of the same language. This paradigm gained momentum after the publication of Trenghu book Dialects and Context, which surveyed the rather dispersed literature on the topic up to that date, presented new case studies for the context, and most importantly, synthesized and set out outcomes coming of the most form of the contact of this kind. Is argued that in the dialect, contact, situation, and interaction later on. There are functional approaches, and there are three approaches: functional grammar by Dick, and role and reference grammar by Foley and Van Valen, and systematic functional grammar by Halliday. FG and PRG are moderate functional theories. These theories reject the conception of grammatical structure, but each process different replacement view of the structure. FG view of language: the language system is not concerned as an autonomous set of rules, rather it is assumed that the rules can only be understood when they are analyzed in terms of condition of use. And RRG is concerned not only with the relation of co-occurrence, that combination is strictly formal terms, but also with semantic and pragmatic co-occurrence and combination relation. And the next is formal and functional approaches. Functionalist: those linguists who believe language as system of communication and take the communicative function of language to be important for its analysis. Next is formalist: consider that communicative function of language to be irrelevant to its analysis following Chomsky. These are the two formal and functional approaches. Next is conclusion. All functionalists agreed that language is a system of forms from conveying meaning in communication, and therefore that is order to understand it is necessary to investigate that interaction of structure, meaning, and communicative functions. So thank you very much for your presence, and by the end of this lecture I would like to discuss a major branch of historical language today utilizes functionally and contextually oriented approaches which explore linguistic pattern of usage of past stage of the language. This is recently covered under the heading of Modern Historical Linguistics in 2006. So tell new stories about socio-pragmatic of the cognitive linguistic phenomena that has changed the mind stable in the course of language history. So thank you very much class for your presence, for your attentions. Thank you very much.